Yeah. I want to tell you a story about one of my favorite shows growing up. A story about six single friends living in New York, and it was one of the best comedies on TV for several years. It helped launch the careers of its cast members and left them with some pretty nice syndication checks. But we all, meaning us the audience, got the benefit from viewing genuine and compassionate adult relationships. And I'm not talking about Friends. Sorry, but no. And before we get started, I'd like to thank Laurier from the channel Old Dirty History for collaborating with me on this video. This is actually a companion piece to a video that she's doing on her channel, so you're going to want to go over there to make sure you get a full analysis of what's being discussed. Otherwise, you're going to miss out. So make sure you stop out Old Dirty History and give them a like and a subscribe. The link is in the description and probably in a pinned comment. I'm going to ping pong it all over here. Living Single was part of a blueprint for a new type of sitcom, one that focused on chosen families instead of the nuclear family design that filled most of the TV blocks. The basic premise involves an ensemble cast of 4 women and 2 men living in a brownstone in Brooklyn. And I'll get to this point a little later, but compared to the Manhattan setting of Friends, Brooklyn felt like an integral part of Living Single's story, whereas Friends could have taken place in any major city in the country. As I mentioned, this show is an ensemble cast. We have Khadijah, played by Queen Latifah, owner and operator of Flavor, an independent art and culture magazine. Her cousin Sinclair, played by Kim Coles, is new to the city and works for Khadijah as a receptionist at Flavor. Kim Fields comes in as Regine, the last of her roommates, and she portrays the bougie one. And rounding out our female cast, we have Erica Alexander as motherfucking Maxine Shaw, attorney at law, who lives across the street, best friends and former college roommate of Khadijah. Our male cast consists of John Hetton as Overton, our lovable handyman who represents the average Joe, and T.C. Carson as Kyle, our stand-in for black excellence who works for a brokerage firm. They share an apartment next door to Khadijah, Sinclair, and Regine. And this cast helped revolutionize depictions of blackness on TV by just being ordinary. Yes, blackness is an integral part of what made the show great, but we got to enjoy it without trauma as a prerequisite. There wasn't any abuse or any baby mama, baby daddy drama. No gator two-stepping in the hallway, just regular people navigating life. Aesthetically, it was full of bold fashion trends, both contemporary mainstream as well as including black fashion trends, especially the hair. Whether it be box braids, locks, or fades, they all represented an image of blackness that actually reflected black fashion and culture.
There's a cost to seeing black womanhood repackaged, stripped of its richness, rinsed of its roots, and sold back to the world like an unseasoned cold piece of chicken breast. Message! And this isn't new. Black culture sets the trends and evolves pre-existing ones.
This looks normal, right?
Whether it's music, fashion, or memes we made for us that somehow end up on tote bags at Target. And TV is no different. Living Single was the blueprint. When it premiered in '93, it gave us 4 black women living and thriving in Brooklyn who were funny, fly, complex, and completely rooted in black culture. Khadijah ran her own magazine. Maxine was a brilliant attorney who was really good at cutting people down with her quick wit. Regine knew her worth and she was not afraid to express it. And Sinclair was just so sweet and whimsical. These were characters that had so much depth and they were vastly different from one another. And so Living Single as a television show not only reflected a sense of diversity when it came to race and culture, but it was also a diverse cast when it came to representation of what black women look like. These characters weren't fulfilling the strong black woman trope that's commonly found in media and continues to be depicted today. They were complex. They had friendships, flaws, ambitions, and challenges. And they weren't just sidekicks. They weren't the supporting characters in someone else's arc. And then same city, same setup, but this time the culture gone. Blackness nowhere to be found.
What the fuck is going on here?
The formula was repackaged as gluten-free and gentrified. Friends took the formula and made it palatable for white audiences. And so despite the impact Living Single made, this was the show that defined a generation and gained international recognition. And Friends isn't the only show to do it, and they won't be the last. But I feel it's a perfect case study on the entertainment industry rewarding imitation and appropriation over how black innovation gets whitewashed, syndicated, and sold as universal, while the original gets sidelined as too urban or just a black show. And let's not forget, even when Friends tried to diversify with the inclusion of a black femme character, shout out to Aisha Tyler's character Charlie, her entire storyline was being a black woman sandwiched between two awkward white dudes. She just wasn't treated with the same depth. It was giving, here, damn, you're welcome type of energy. Compare that to Living Single, where black women openly talk about hair, workplace racism, dating and relationships, and the struggles of being black and ambitious. And this isn't about blaming Friends for being a white show in a white era, but there's a long tradition of black womanhood being mined for content, and not just in television, but across the entertainment industry. But in the same breath, it's not being respected as culture. And the industry keeps asking black women to be their muse without ever letting us own the masterpiece or tell our own stories. As a young girl, seeing Khadijah, Max, Regine, and Sinclair on TV, it was more than just entertaining for me. It was affirming. You could be smart, you could be funny, awkward, complicated. You could be yourself and still be loved and still be seen.
And there was something else that I didn't peep until I rewatched. The show didn't code switch for a white audience, or rather the show and the dialogue were written with black viewers in mind, but there wasn't any disjointed switch-ups. To simplify switch coding for white people, imagine your job interview voice. Slightly more polished around the edges, you'll probably drop any colloquialisms from your speech. That's code switching. But in a cultural context, it's the need to shift the manner in which black people carry ourselves as a way of maintaining respectability in predominantly white spaces. That's something a lot of black Americans do to assimilate into white culture. I'm doing it right now. Did you notice? Now, Living Single was part of a new onslaught of sitcoms that centered friendship as family. These characters were interwoven within each other's lives in a way that felt authentic. Like the characters had a real reason to engage with each other, and not in a way that feels like the producers just wanted certain pairings to have more screen time. And I mean, that's literally how sitcoms work, but it was done well in Living Single. They felt like real friends, like you could actually picture them hanging out with each other, whereas Friends of the show felt like it was built on focus group testing. And while we're here, let's compare Living Single to Friends real quick. You have Monica, who serves as a Khadijah parallel, our independent one and the voice of reason for the cast. Chandler serves as a stand-in for Max, very sarcastic and quick to roast any of the other cast. Phoebe is a parallel to Sinclair, the quirky optimist of the group. Joey is our Overton, goofy, and lovable, and Rachel Regine share the same mode as a fashion-forward one that's a little vain, and in the first season at least comes off as really vapid. Kyle is pure black excellence, and there's no parallel for Ross. That man is a creep, and his pathetic fawning over Rachel helped establish the friend zone as part of our lexicon. But these are your carbon copies. The absence of blackness or brown or any other color in Friends wasn't accidental. It was a marketing strategy, a way of erasing any connection this show had to its predecessor in creating this sort of stasis bubble. And when I say predecessor, I mean it. The entire format from Friends was taken from Living Single. It was just watered down so much as to wash out all the flavor. Executives have gone on record acknowledging that Friends was inspired by Living Single, just dipped in acetone. There is no slang, no politics, no direct engagement with identity. Hell, there weren't even any New York accents. Whereas the city of New York actually felt like a backdrop in Living Single, Friends made New York feel like a small white suburb. It represents a very sanitized and tourist-friendly version of New York. The quirky white friend group replaced an authentic black urban experience with one of bland ambiguity. You can watch an episode of Living Single and feel like you're looking at real characters display a real range of emotions. And when you watch Friends, well, you probably had to go to your city or your town's equivalent of downtown during the week. Maybe you had a dentist appointment or something, right? And you see folks going for a jog, just kicking it in a cafe in the middle of the day, and you wonder what kind of life they got that affords them the luxury of just sitting around during peak work hours. That feeling of wondering if they just got it like that, or maybe they're tourists or something, that's how it feels watching the cast of Friends. Like watching tourists or detached yuppies gentrifying the neighborhood. That gentrification occurred through syndication. Friends dominated cable for decades while Living Single struggled for visibility, relegated to markets that predominantly served black audiences, your TV One, BET, Bounce TV. Meanwhile, Friends was everywhere. It got the syndication and marketing push to keep it on our radars for far longer than our attention spans would usually allow. It makes me wonder how much praise would be heaped on Friends if we weren't told repeatedly that it was a good show, with the marketing for the reruns doing more heavy lifting than the network's active programming. The Friends IP is a cash cow. It generated $1 billion since the show first aired. But the money didn't come pouring in right away. Warner Brothers Television licensed the 30-minute comedy for NBC. For the first 4 years, the production company actually lost money on the show, gambling that it would pay off later when syndication kicked in. By the time Friends entered its 5th season, NBC was so intent on keeping the sitcom in its Thursday night lineup that it agreed to cover the cost of production. Over its 10-year broadcast run, that overhead included an estimated $70 million in producer fees for Brightman, Kaufman, Crane, and almost $100 million for the stars, whose salaries rose from a modest $22.5 per episode in the first season to $1 million a show rate in the final 2 seasons, making Aniston, Cox, and Kudros the highest paid actresses at the time. The real payoff began once the show entered syndication. With nearly 100 episodes banked over the first 4 years, Warner Brothers had enough shows to begin selling reruns to local stations, cable networks, and channels outside the US, and ultimately streaming services, and a string of deals that Forbes estimated to be around $4.8 billion for the production company. Friends was known as an anchor show, the one that gets people hooked, or in the case of shows like The Simpsons, the show that your network is the most recognizable for. It's that recognition, or realistically a relatability, that began to get pushed to an American audience. You see, one of the biggest problems is that black popular culture veers into new directions as it gives voice to social and racial concerns and issues. And you can't sell content with social and/or racial issues to a predominantly white audience. Or at least that's how the network execs see it. You see, they think you're stupid. In the eyes of media companies and marketing executives, the average white American can't hang. It becomes a self-imposed "they not like us." So here, take this, Friends, and if you can behave yourself, you can get this will and grace. But you're not trusted to handle anything deeper than that. You see the proliferation of television distribution channels, beginning with the rise of cable in the 1980s and followed by the emergence of new broadcast networks like Fox, the WB, and UPN, fundamentally reshaped the landscape of sitcom production and audience targeting. With viewership no longer concentrated among the 3 dominant networks, NBC, CBS, and ABC, the imperative to craft shows that appealed simultaneously to both black and white audiences began to erode. The fragmentation of audience share created space for niche programming strategies, most notably sitcoms that unapologetically centered black life and culture. For fledgling networks like Fox and later the WB and UPN, courting black audiences through cultural specific content was not only viable but strategic, helping them gain a foothold in an increasingly crowded media environment. However, this expansion of black targeted programming also revealed an underlying anxiety within the television industry, the persistent belief among network executives that white audiences would not or could not relate to narratives that centered experiences of ethnic minorities. As newer networks leaned into more culturally distinct programming, the legacy broadcasters retreated from the relatively diverse sitcom formulas and instead doubled down on predominantly white ensemble comedies such as Seinfeld, Friends, and Frasier. In doing so, they effectively redefined universal appeal as a euphemism for white cultural norms. The assumption that mainstream success required white leads and predominantly white stories reinforced a dangerous feedback loop, one in which relatability became code for white and ethnic specificity was treated as a commercial risk unless tucked away on niche platforms. This shift reflects more than just market segmentation. It exposes a deeper ideological reluctance to trust white audiences with stories outside their own cultural experiences. Rather than challenge viewers to expand their empathetic reach, network decisions revealed a tacit belief that whiteness was not just a default identity for characters, but the default setting for emotional and comedic resonance. In this environment, the potential for sitcoms to function as cross-cultural bridges diminished, replaced by an industry logic that equated mass appeal with racial homogeneity. Where Fox once courted an African-American niche on Thursday evenings with a lineup of Living Single, Between Brothers, and New York Undercover, by fall of 1998, the network featured reality programming such as World's Wildest Police Chases and Fox Files. These programs drew the male 18 to 34 demographic, allowing Fox to trade up for demographic advertisers valued for this perceived cultural capital and buying power, while abandoning black viewers who helped the network compete with the Big Three. The purge was not limited to Fox, as broadcast networks canceled 13 dramas and sitcoms featuring black casts at the end of the 1997-98 season. That's why Living Single couldn't be pushed globally, because its cultural specificity wasn't considered safe. The golden age of 90s sitcoms was not a level playing field. What gets remembered as feel-good and family-friendly was deeply shaped by race, politics, and market forces. The traditional 90s sitcom structure came with 2 variations: the standard good vibes and situational comedy, so-and-so had a job interview or stole something from another lead character, hilarity would ensue, yada yada, big laugh. Now outside of that, we have what was referred to as a very special episode. Basically, these were the episodes that focus on hard-hitting issues, whether that be gang violence, SA, drug abuse. These shows were designed to impart a safety message to the audience. And these were really prominent in the late 80s and 90s, especially with Stranger Danger and the crack epidemic. But this isn't something you get a lot of today. With the push towards establishing and centering a middle-class white aesthetic free from the harms of the world, these things were done away with. And a very special episode was a thing that was pretty popular up until the early to mid 90s, and I think it could be argued that the black sitcom fell to the wayside for the same reason that the very special episodes were basically done away with. It makes the audience think too much. The lived experience of blackness inherently makes every episode a very special episode, at least to white America. To media companies, culture signifiers like hair and speech tone alienate white audiences. Remember, they think you're stupid. To Bob over on TV Brands LLC, you're nothing more than a delicate snowflake, and seeing a face like mine may cause you to fall into a shame spiral. And they don't want an aggrieved white fan base unless they can sell you the fix. And the fix that network TV used in the mid to late 90s was called relatability. The relatability was really just a loaded term that was used historically as a way to exclude shows that centered black life. What we saw then and see now are the remnants of a system that wanted black viewership only when convenient, and because of that hardly ever used any writing talent that reflected the black community. This of course meant that even the black shows that made it to screen were hit and miss. Beginning in the mid to late 1980s, television networks began aggressively producing black sitcoms, flooding primetime with shows like 227, Amen, A Different World, with shows like Family Matters and The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air soon to follow. By the mid 1990s, there were over a dozen black-centered sitcoms on air. But quantity didn't mean quality, especially when it came to meaningful representation. Many of these shows leaned into tired stereotypes, offering watered down or outright caricature versions of black life. For black audiences, it became clear that these sitcoms weren't a reflection of our reality, but rather what white producers imagined it to be. Without black writers in the room, the result was often exaggerated sass, shallow plots, and characters stuck in a loop of buffoonery and double entendres. The lack of behind-the-scenes representation meant that many of these series were doomed from the start, unable to capture the nuance or complexity of black communities. Shows like New Attitude recycled tropes, reducing its black female characters to over-the-top loudmouth hairdressers. In many cases, the comedy wasn't just unfunny, it was kinda offensive, echoing minstrel traditions dressed up in modern aesthetics. Eventually, networks realized that these shows weren't resonating. With little traction among black audiences and no significant crossover appeal, many sitcoms were pulled from the lineup. But the response wasn't precise, it was a sweep. In a single year, 1989 to 1990, 4 black sitcoms were canceled in rapid succession, including 227, New Attitude, and Sugar and Spice. Unfortunately, this wave of cancellations also took down more promising series that had the potential to evolve into thoughtful representation of black life, but were cut before they had the chance. The Purge highlighted a deeper issue. Without black creatives guiding the stories, even well-meaning shows were vulnerable to missteps, misreads, and ultimately early death. Living Single avoided most of those pitfalls and was still canceled. And, well, I've been watching the Reliving Single podcast as part of my research for this. And if you didn't know, Erica Alexander, who played the character Max, and Kim Coles, who played the character Sinclair, co-host a podcast where they go over the series and share some behind-the-scenes knowledge. Now, in episode 2 of the podcast, they go over the pilot, and something jumped out at me. I hadn't really thought about the hair, specifically Kyle and Max's hair. I mean, I acknowledged that Kyle wore locks in the workplace as related to her storyline, but I didn't realize how big a deal it was for A, characters like Max and Kyle with Afrocentric hairstyles to exist in a 90s sitcom, and B, for them both to have prominent careers in spaces where aesthetics, especially those that link to cultural heritage, have been policed. Hell, even John Henton rocked a little Gumby fade till he started losing his hair. But Kyle and Max disrupted the notion that you needed to be clean cut to avoid being overlooked for career opportunities. It's something that black people, specifically black women, have to account for with every job. Which hairstyles are they going to wear that's going to coincidentally be added to the list as not appropriate for work? Hair is one of the more important aspects of representation that often isn't taken into account when designing black characters or hiring stylists with experience with black hair textures. And it can be pretty bad. Black folk hair in the media be looking real, you know, like they went to Supercuts. That's all I'm going to say. I'm trying not to make this a political video. But it helps to have the right voices present. And something that Living Single doesn't get enough credit for is how it quietly subverted one of the most persistent tropes in black sitcoms: colorism. Think about it. Kyle and Max, the 2 darkest skinned characters in the main cast, also had the most traditionally professional careers. Kyle was a sharp, successful stockbroker. Max was a formidable attorney. And neither of them were there for comic relief or just there to take up space. They were the standard. They were desirable, powerful, and fully dimensional. That stands in stark contrast to how colorism typically plays out. Compare that to Martin, which aired in the same block. Gina is positioned as a respectable one, light-skinned, career-driven, and feminine. Pam, her dark-skinned counterpart, is loud, confrontational, and the butt of the joke more oftentimes than not. One is framed as the ideal, the other as a punchline, even though they had the same career. Pam had her own crib, and she was dating a plug. But Living Single didn't play that game. There was no light-skinned savior or respectability figure used to balance out the cast. Max was brilliant and messy. Kyle was professional and petty. Their skin color wasn't used to define their social class or value, it was just part of who they were. And that made me think about how omnipresent the series Friends is compared to Living Single, and how there weren't any major styles or trends that could be associated with Friends beyond Jennifer Aniston, that bob cut that was called the Rachel for a couple of years, and nips, like a lot of nips. I have a rule when I go out and eat, not hard and fast, but I have a rule. No ethnic food spots that cater to the tourist crowd. For example, I eat a lot of falafel, and I'm gonna go to the Aki Bulls or the Spicy White Homies and they're gonna hook it up. Now, a nice falafel and rice with some tzatziki, maybe some baba ganoush, is gonna taste completely different in my neighborhood compared to South Street in Philly, which is a huge tourist strip. All the same components are there, but the flavor profile is flatter. To make sure it sells to everybody, the food is stripped down to its barest essentials, just ethnic enough to make the crowd feel adventurous without alienating more sensitive palates. That's what happened with Living Single, toned down until it's Friends.
A producer of that show as well?
Towards the end.
Yeah.
You know, towards
I'm
the
assuming
very
you will
end.
be a producer of the reboot.
Now, is this all, I thought Friends was the reboot.
Oh, you know about that too?
That's really funny.
I like you. I like the way you think. I like the way you think.
And it would be pretty easy for me to let it hang there, let it feel like a grand conspiracy to remove all traces of diversity. No, that's his current presidential administration. But the truth is always more mundane. Racist, but it's that mundane racism. The Yankees cap of racism. The Wonder Bread of racism. The default of racism. What we see here is whiteness as a default. The bare bones expected standard for art, class, and beauty. And when you see yourself as a default, it can be hard to understand why this is important because it never had to be important for you. As a white American, the image, identity, and social stratification are not perceived as a reflection of whiteness, even though it definitely is. What we remember isn't always what mattered to most. It's what was most accessible, most promoted, and most algorithm friendly.
I have fond memories when I was a teen where I would fall asleep with Adult Swim in the background. And if you're a fellow weeb, you already know. Yep, that one. I fell asleep to Inuyasha all the time, or I would wake up in the middle of the night to this song playing. This song, this show, became ingrained into my psyche to the point where it now holds a place in my memories that triggers fondness and nostalgia. Some shows don't just air once, they loop. They become background noise and bedtime lullabies. They play so often that you start quoting them before you even understand the jokes. That's syndication in television. It's not just about reruns, it's about repetition that becomes a cultural phenomenon, and which stories get handed down like heirlooms and which get lost like a dusty old borrowed DVD that you never returned. But technically speaking, syndication is when studios sell the right to air a show to multiple networks or platforms. But it's also a system that gets to decide what gets remembered. Shows that get syndicated are not just rewatched, they are preserved. They air again and again across time zones and across generations, embedding themselves into our collective memory. And the studios that control those rights become the curators of cultural memory. And that's a lot of power. What they choose to air becomes most familiar, and what they don't just fades. I remember watching reruns of I Love Lucy when I was really young, and I love that show, but I think it's a perfect example of the impact that syndication has on memory, because I Love Lucy first aired in the year of our Lord 1951, and this was the late 90s I'm talking about. And I watched I Love Lucy not because I sought it out. 9-10-year-old me wasn't like, oh my god, I need to find a black and white show from the 50s about a housewife and all of her crazy shenanigans. I watched it because syndication made sure that it was in front of me. That's how shows become iconic and remembered, not just by being great, but by just being there to begin with. Television doesn't just reflect culture, it teaches us what to remember, what's important. Syndicated shows reinforce certain values as well as aesthetics, often white, middle class, and they erase others. It's not just about the stories we hear, it's about the stories that we hear again and again and again. Since Friends ended, it's become syndicated, streamed, memed, merchandised nonstop. You can catch it on cable, streaming platforms, or social media in every time zone across various different countries. Meanwhile, Living Single, which came first and arguably inspired the whole format, literally bar for bar, barely shows up in comparison. It's harder to find, it's rarely pushed on streaming platforms, and it's often left out of nostalgia programming. And that erasure matters. According to a study that conducted an analysis of network television lineups from 1966 to 1992, only 10% of newly introduced network TV characters were Black, and only 35% were women. That means Black women, like the leads in Living Single, were statistical anomalies in primetime television. So when Living Single gave us 4 fully developed characters who were Black women leading their own stories, it wasn't just refreshing, it was revolutionary. But here's the thing, representation does not guarantee remembrance. For a show to leave a cultural imprint, it has to be accessible, replayed, quoted, memed. It's gotta be in a GIF that your corny coworker sent to you over Slack. Friends got that treatment and Living Single didn't. And this difference has real consequences. Networks chase what they think will syndicate well. And because syndication favors whiteness, homogeneity gets reinforced. When only certain shows are rebroadcast for decades, they become a definitive image of a time while others disappear from the story altogether. Martin, Girlfriends, the Wayans brothers, these are all very beloved shows, but they receive nowhere near the rerun real estate of shows like Seinfeld or The Big Bang Theory. When Black stories don't re-air, it sends the message that they were never that important to begin with. And in turn, that creates a feedback loop where shows that don't get reruns don't get greenlit again. And syndication isn't just about culture, it's about money too. Syndication deals often make more money than the original airing of a show, and they go disproportionately to shows with white middle-class characters, and that repeat exposure keeps the actors paid. Remember when HBO did that Friends reunion special? I know I do. They advertised it like crazy, and word on the curb is that each one of the main cast of Friends received $5 million just for a one-night show. But that's a penny in the pot compared to what they made over the course of their entire Friends career. Syndication doesn't just rerun shows, it rewrites history. When Friends loops endlessly and Living Single is treated like a footnote, it tells us which friendships matter, which stories matter, which faces deserve to be remembered, and ultimately which stories get told again.
And when it comes to sitcoms, at least prior to the streaming age, syndication functions as an engine of memory. What I mean is that it drives this pseudo-nostalgia for an old product by reminding us of its excellence through taglines and advertisements. We don't get to form a real memory and association with the product. Living Single got patchy local syndication, rarely hitting primetime hours outside of urban markets. I remember as a teen, if I wanted to watch Kyle Serenade Max, I needed to go into my grandmother's VHS collection and hope that it was one of the episodes she taped. Meanwhile, Friends had a syndication slot that was damn near identical to the one that they held while on the air. When streaming platforms first emerged, they were framed as a kind of media revolution, an open field where anything could happen, where hidden gems would finally get their shine. But if you're paying attention, it didn't take long to realize that this so-called democratization of content came with its own set of gatekeepers, and once again the gate was firmly locked to the stories that centered Black people, especially Black women. Take our examples of Friends and Living Single. As Netflix became the dominant platform in the 2010s, Friends wasn't just available, it was front and center. It had its own category banners, constant homepage promotion, and even an entire social media marketing campaign dedicated to its presence. Netflix reportedly paid $100 million just to keep Friends on its platform for a single year, signaling to the industry and viewers alike that Friends wasn't just a show, it was a piece of timeless culture, the kind of product that could cross generations and borders. Meanwhile, Living Single, the actual blueprint, was nowhere to be found. Not on Netflix, not on Amazon Prime, not on HBO Max, even though it was produced by Warner Brothers, the same studio behind Friends. For years, Living Single existed in this weird digital limbo, unstreamable unless you bought individual episodes or DVDs, and finally landed on Hulu almost quietly with no real announcement, no curated nostalgia rollout, and no trending hashtags to speak of. A show that defined an era and opened doors for ensemble comedies built around professional women of color was treated like a forgotten footnote. And that silence, that was not an accident, it was strategy. Streaming platforms invest in what they think will travel, meaning what they believe will resonate with a wide audience, code for white audience. In practice, this creates a pipeline that mirrors old network biases but hides them behind shiny new tech. The same narrative that got most airtime during cable syndication, the mostly white, mostly middle class, mostly apolitical ones, are still getting a push. They're just doing it in your queue instead of the TV guide. That brings us to what we might call platform bias, and more specifically, algorithmic racism. The algorithm isn't neutral, it's trained on data, and that data reflects history. It learns from what's already popular, which usually means what's already been made popular by previous systems of promotion and power. So when a show like Friends does well, the algorithm keeps recommending it. It keeps surpassing other shows like it. It keeps feeding a beast, and when a show like Living Single finally shows up, it doesn't get recommended unless it's already trending. You practically have to go looking for it. That's the trick with streaming. It produces endless choices but subtly curates what you see. You're led to believe the most visible shows are the best shows, or at least the most universal. But what gets framed as universal is still being shamed by the same old lens. White, middle class, and culturally generic enough to not alienate anyone. But the idea that black culture or Latinx culture or queer culture is somehow niche unless it's wrapped in trauma or viral discourse, that's a lie. It's a calculated omission dressed up as audience preference. This isn't just about what's available to stream, it's about who gets canonized, who gets remembered, and who gets to be comfort food for the generation. Because let's keep it real, streaming isn't just the future of TV, it's a new form of memory. The shows that get placements on splash pages and trend lists are the ones that stick around. They become the culture we revisit, meme, quote, and remake. So when shows like Living Single are buried behind a paywall or quietly shuffled onto less traffic corners of a platform, it's not just an oversight, it's erasure. Soft, strategic, and systematic. The decline of Living Single's momentum wasn't just a result of shifting industry priorities. It also involved internal pushback that came with consequences. T.C. Carson, who portrayed Kyle Barker, was written off the show after its 4th season. While casting changes are not uncommon in television, Carson has since stated that his departure stemmed from ongoing tensions with the studio, particularly around how the show is being managed in the wake of Friends' success. Within the cast, Carson had taken on an informal leadership role. Rather than having multiple cast members voice concerns to producers, Carson often acted as a spokesperson advocating on behalf of the group. And according to Carson, this dynamic combined with direct feedback about the show's direction and treatment ultimately made him a target.
There was a rumor going around that I was difficult to work with, that I come to work unprepared, and all of this was not true, you know. But I found out I was auditioning for this show. It was African American casting director. It's my callback. And I came in, I did the audition. He said, well, let's sit and talk for a minute. I said, oh, cool. We sit and we're talking. He said, so, Living Single, what happened? And I gave the standard line that I had been given. It's like, well, you know, they wanted to make some changes, and they didn't want to touch any other girls, and Overton had married Sinclair, so I was the obvious person. He said, well, that's not what I heard. And I said, really? He said, what did you hear? He said, well, I heard that you were difficult. I heard that you came to work unprepared. I said, you know what? This interview's over. Thank you so much for your time. And I just got up and walked out. Because at that point, I'm not gonna let a black man sit here and berate me in front of these white people.
Oh, he hit you with that move.
He's not gonna do that to me.
Yeah.
So I said, you know what? This interview is over. I really thank you all for your time. And I just got up and left. Went to my car and I lost it, man, because to have somebody lying on you, to tell untruths about you that messes up your work was really devastating to me, because I had never been disrespectful. I had never been unprepared. None of that shit. And to know that this was going around about me, this is why I wasn't getting auditions. I was like, so this is what they had to do to cover up the fact that you fired me. It's like, oh, so you got to make it seem like I'm the bad person.
The parallels between Carson and his character Kyle are hard to ignore. Both were articulate, principled, and unafraid to challenge authority, traits that may have contributed to a perception of Carson as difficult to work with. And whether or not that perception was fair, the result was clear. The show continued without him, and the circumstances of his exit were rarely addressed publicly. Carson's experience reflects broader patterns in the entertainment industry, where actors, particularly on majority black productions, can face professional consequences for raising concerns that might be more readily accommodated on larger white-led shows. In the end result, we keep reinforcing the same story, that Friends is iconic while Living Single is a cult classic at best. That's how cultural memory gets curated. Not by what's loved, but by what's boosted. Streaming promises liberation, but for black creatives, especially black women, the same doors are locked. Black creators frequently originate the blueprints for cultural success, style, humor, or structure, but rarely get recognition or the platform to scale it. The biggest cultural trends usually begin with the marginalized. Need is the mother of innovation after all, so it's fitting, as with everything else in pop culture, what we make, the world takes. And that's not a bad thing. It's only bad when divorced from context and pushed as original. I wasn't a fan of Friends when it was on the air, but I caught up to it when I moved out and couldn't afford cable. I'm a dinosaur and this was pre-streaming. But what I caught up on was okay. In a vacuum, it's a pretty good show. But when its predecessor is factored in, I can't help but feel like Friends was nerfed a little bit. There was just too much breading, wonder breading. In an attempt to target the broadest white audience, the creators ended up crafting something so bland that only the actors themselves could make the show watchable. I'm serious, the cast of Friends don't really feel like people, let alone friends. Take Monica and Joey. Monica is introduced as a neat freak with control issues, and 10 seasons later, still a neat freak with control issues. Joey starts off as a womanizing airhead and ends exactly the same way. They're not characters so much as caricatures, built around one or two exaggerated traits and kept there for the sake of predictability. Their emotions are big, loud, and often played for laughs, but they rarely shift in meaningful ways. Growth would mean evolution, and Friends wasn't really interested in that. Now compare that to Living Single, where Khadijah doesn't just run for a magazine and deliver snark. She wrestles with commitment, trust, and letting other people in to help her. By the end, she gets back with Scooter not because the show needed a neat romantic bow, but because she earned it. We've seen her push people away and slowly learn not to. And Sinclair, she could have just been a quirky sidekick, but instead we see her chase acting, fall in love, and step into herself with surprising emotional range. Living Single gave its women space to show. Friends gave us catchphrases.
Hey, how you doing?
The legacy of Living Single and its creator Yvette Lee Bowser is a textbook case of how black innovation is often erased or repackaged without credit. While Friends, a show that essentially acted as a sanitized reboot for Living Single, catapulted its creator to $1 million development deals and lifelong accolades, Bowser remains largely overlooked in the same industry. Friends borrowed the formula, 6 young adults navigating work, love, and life in a city, but stripped it of its flavor, repackaged it in beige tones for white consumption. It was a reboot. I know I said the word a dozen times, but it was a reboot without seasoning. Cultural cannibalism for the most bland palates. This erasure continues well into the present. Even with the arrival of shows like Insecure, critics still call them groundbreaking for portraying themes Living Single had already made foundational. Black women balancing friendship, careers, and their love lives. The praise is deserved, but the framing reveals a problem. When black shows did it first, they were niche. When white or newer shows do it later, they're revolutionary. This cultural amnesia took place without active efforts to disregard contributions of black creators. Now we live in a time where that is exactly what is happening. Active efforts to remove minority contributions from the history books, whitewashing past transgressions away with it. This isn't just about sitcoms, it's about who gets remembered and who you're told to forget.